Hi everyone, I just wanted to go over the procedure for the separations lab with you. I don't anticipate you'll really have any trouble with this lab, but nevertheless, I wanted to at least go over the procedure with you. So in this experiment, essentially you're going to mix sand and salt together, and then you're going to exploit the fact that one is soluble in water and one is not, and then you're going to separate them again. Okay, so let's just go over the procedure. So I'll just go step by step. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to use your balance, so your little scale that you have. You're going to weigh a 150 ml beaker and record the mass. And whenever it says record, if you look on your report sheet here, you'll see that there's a space to record the mass of the beaker. Okay, so take your 150 ml beaker and take its mass and write that down on your report sheet. Next, you will add 1/3 of the coarse sand to the 150 ml beaker and then weigh it again. So now what you have is you have the mass of the beaker and the sand. So if we subtract the mass of the beaker, that will tell us the mass of the sand, and that's the next step. So it says subtract the mass obtained in step 1 from the mass obtained in step 3. This is the mass of the sand, and it's going to ask you to record that. Okay, next, you'll add a spoonful of table salt into the same beaker, so the same beaker with the sand. Weigh the beaker again and record the mass. Okay, so weigh the beaker with the mixture of the sand and the salt, record the mass, and then subtract the value from number 4 from number 6. Okay, so essentially, in other words, you're going to take the difference between the sand and beaker, and then once you add the salt, then take the difference between those. Okay, and that will tell you the mass of just the salt. So in other words, you're just looking at how much did the mass of the beaker and the sand change when you added the salt. That will tell you how much salt you added. Okay, then next it says add just enough water to dissolve the salt. It says note, if you add too much water, it will take a very long time to recover the salt from the water. Okay, so just enough, and we know that salt is extremely soluble in water, so you should not have to use a whole lot here, so just enough. Okay, so it says use the glass stir rod to stir the mixture, making sure that all the salt dissolves completely. And it says weigh the 250 ml beaker and record the mass. Okay, so fold one piece of filter paper in half. Now fold the filter paper in half once again, so it becomes a quarter of the original filter paper. And if you come to the blackboard, I have actually done this for you and taken some photos, so you can see exactly what it should end up looking like. So you'll take the filter paper, so it starts off as just a disc, and then you can fold it in half and you end up with sort of a hard shell taco shape. Okay, then you fold it again and you end up with sort of a triangle, and then it will ask you to actually spread or to push 3 of the layers to the side, and you'll end up with this sort of cone shape. Okay, so that's step 11 through 13, and then 14 you actually put that into your filter, or your funnel, excuse me. So you should have a plastic funnel. Okay, so number 16, use one hand, hold the stem of the plastic funnel over the 250 ml beaker, and it says using the other hand slowly pour, and this is also known as decanting, the water from the salt and sand mixture into the funnel, making sure not to fill more than 3/4 of the filter, otherwise some of your mixture could slip through. Okay, so in other words, you never want to completely fill the filter paper with the solution or the mixture, because if you do, obviously it can just find its way around the filter paper. So it's always going to find, the path of least resistance, so it will actually slip around the filter paper, and you'll end up, essentially you'll end up not filtering it. Okay, so 18, just keep doing this until you filter the entire mixture. And it says wash the remaining sand by adding water and repeat the filtration process so that all of the liquid is transferred to the funnel. And the reason you're doing this step is to make sure that you get all of the salt extracted from the sand. Otherwise, you'll end up leaving some of it behind. Okay, so it says pour the wet sand, scraping as much as possible onto a few layers of paper towels. Okay, then you're going to allow this to dry. And then it says you should clean your 150 ml beaker and you won't need that again. Okay, so it says spread the sand across paper towels and allow it to air dry. And it says the longer you allow the sand to air dry, the better your results will be. So really, you want to let this sit overnight, and not just for an hour or two. Really, overnight or even 2 days would be good. And the reason for that is if you don't really allow the sand to dry, you're going to end up with a higher mass than what you started with. So your percent yield will be, 110% or something like that. Okay, so you don't want to do that. You really want to make sure you allow it to dry. You could even turn your oven on very, very low and put it in your oven to help dry it. That's not necessary. If you just wait, it will dry it by itself. But if you want to really, really, really get the best possible results you can, and remember, I'm not worried if your results are perfectly correct or not, but if you're interested in getting better results, you could allow it to dry for a few hours and then turn your oven on very, very low. And when I say low, I mean probably the lowest setting you can. Like if it has just a very, very low setting, just above room temperature, basically, is all you're trying to do here. And that way you don't run the risk of anything catching on fire or anything like that. But again, that's not necessary, and honestly, it probably is overcomplicating it. Okay, then it says collect the sand and pour the dried sand back into the beaker, and weigh the beaker and record the mass. And you can calculate the mass of the sand by subtracting, just like you did before. Okay, it says record the mass of the sand. And number 26 here, so you could actually, while you're waiting on the sand to dry, you could skip to this step 26, because it needs to be done simultaneously, essentially. So in order to get your full results, you're going to dry the sand, and then you're going to remove the water from the salt, and recover the salt, and then weigh it. Okay, so it says 26, using a hot plate, heat the beaker containing the salt water until the water boils. Continue to boil until the water is gone and only the salt remains. So you should end up with a fine white powder inside of the beaker. And in this step, you really don't want it to be a roaring boil. So in other words, you just want enough so that there's steam coming out. You don't want it to be out of control. One important thing when you're doing these kind of things in chemistry is be in control. Don't let the beaker just run wild. Don't just don't just crank the heat to the maximum setting and walk away. That's not going to be good. You're going to end up hurting someone or hurting something. Okay, so, medium setting and just be patient. Something like that. But you really don't need a huge roaring boil. Okay, it says once the beaker is cooled to room temperature, weigh the 250 ml beaker containing the salt, and then again, you'll find the mass of the salt by subtraction. So just the mass of the beaker, or the mass of the salt and the beaker minus the mass of the beaker will tell you just the mass of the salt. Okay, and then lastly it says clean and dry all glassware, and then just put it away for next time. And of course, you're only dealing with sand and salt here. The salt you can throw away, and the sand, if you have something you want to do with it, that's perfectly fine. But I probably would just throw it away since you did use it with your chemistry set. Usually it's a good idea to just get rid of that kind of thing. Okay. So one thing percent you're calculating here is percent yield. So what you're going to end up with is on your report sheet, you'll end up with things like the original mass of the salt and then the mass of the recovered salt. So you'll see it says just the salt, and here it says recovered salt, and they were nice enough to give you step numbers here so you know exactly which step they're talking about. So how are you going to calculate percent yield? So they give you the equation here. So it says the recovered amount, the mass of the component, over the initial amount of the component times 100%. In other words, how much did you start from? That goes on the bottom. And how much did you recover? That goes on the top. And then you multiply that by 100, and that will give you the percent yield. And it would be rare to get 100% yield, even for the best chemist you can ever dream of. That would take a perfect world. We don't live in a perfect world. So expect your results to be somewhere, for a good experiment, you want it somewhere close to 100, so 98, 99. But anywhere in the 90s, you've done a great job. If you see that your percent yield is over 100, likely you have not dried the material well enough. Okay, so if it's your sand, allow it to dry a little longer. If it's the salt, again, just allow it to dry a little longer. and then try again. And you're really looking to get something below 100. If you have something higher, it's still wet. Something low is completely normal. What you don't want is you don't want something like 5%. Okay, that's not a good experiment. So you want something close to 100, but over 100 tells you it's wet. And then again, you want something close to 100, but not exactly 100, because we don't live in a perfect world. Okay, and I didn't go over in the beginning the materials like I normally do, so if you're watching this ahead of time, this will be helpful. So you need the sand, 2 beakers, 150 ml and 250 ml beaker, filter paper, your glass stirring rod, the spatula, hot plate, plastic funnel, and your balance, which is just the scale. And then from your house, you need salt and some paper towels. And probably a good idea to have an oven mitt around in case you need to pull the hot beaker off of the boiling water, or pull the beaker off while it's hot, off the hot plate. Okay. This one I think will be kind of fun because you get to dissolve something and then bring it back, which I think is pretty cool the first time you do it if you've never done something like that before. Alright, good luck, and please feel free to ask me if you have any questions.